Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Mackison, and it is my joy to welcome you this evening, both those who are in the church and especially those who are joining us on YouTube for an evening of imagining the life of Julian of Norwich. During the discussion tonight, there will be an opportunity for questions and comments, and for those online, we will monitor the chat so that you are fully part of the dialogue. It is now my honor to welcome Joanne Findon, the distinguished feminist scholar of medieval Irish literature and a novelist and a writer of children's literature. Joanne.
Thank you, and thank you for all coming. David and I first met when I was a PhD student and finishing up my thesis at the Center for Medieval Studies, where he was teaching. And the year after I finished, I audited a course that he offered for the first time in gender and theory in medieval literature. And it was a wonderful course. It really intersected with a lot of the issues I was dealing with in rewriting my book. And David and I became friends, and we kept in touch over the years. At one point, he revealed that he was working on a novel about Julian of Norwich and her meeting with Margery Kempe. And if any of you have read the book of Margery Kempe, you know this is a really important moment in her story and life. That is kind of echoey, isn't it? Okay, and now since I'm a writer of fiction myself, of course I encourage David to keep working on it. And so it's a real thrill for me to finally see the fruits of all this labor and to see it in print. David has done a marvelous job of breathing life into these characters, and I hope you get a chance to read the book. It just brings it all to life. So, over to you, David.
Joanne, thank you so much. It's such a joy and an honor to be introduced by you, and I am so grateful to you for your encouragement around this book. And Stephen, thank you for welcoming us to the congregation. Thanks in advance to Sharon Kirby for kindly agreeing to read excerpts from the book tonight. To members of the Redeemer Explorers Committee who are making the live event possible, Paul Penkowski, Ann Jervis, Lisa Rumble, John Deacon, AJ Finley, and thanks to all of you who braved really wretched weather to come here. I am touched, and it's very kind of you to show up. I'm not sure I'd come out to hear me tonight, so thank you so much, and I hope I don't disappoint. I hope the book doesn't disappoint. So just over 650 years ago, in 1373, a 30-year-old woman had a near-death experience. And the account that she wrote down is the first book in the English language that we know for certain was written by a woman other than anonymous. And we know her now as Julian of Norwich. Her book is a luminous vision of a loving God in whom there is no wrath, who himself suffers alongside humanity in the flesh of Jesus, who is both father and mother, who in the face of all that is broken in the world will somehow, in the end, make all things well. The text is all about the vision and Julian's faith that it was revealed not just for herself, but for the good of all her fellow Christians. And she tells us almost nothing of the circumstances of her own life. Margery Kempe was 30 years her junior. The book of Margery Kempe survives in a single manuscript that was rediscovered just under 100 years ago. And it's all about the circumstances of her own life all the time. It's an as-told-to account that was apparently recorded by an anonymous priest, and it's another staple of the feminist canon of medieval literature. Marjorie was the Tammy Faye Baker of her day. She fell down wailing in churches at the first sight of a crucifix, and at one point an exasperated priest told her, "Madam, Jesus is long since dead." She was repeatedly accused of heresy. A crowd hounded her through the streets of Canterbury. She may have suffered from severe postpartum depression, and in any case, her book tells us that she went mad and had to be restrained by the servants to keep her from doing herself harm. And then one day, Jesus sat down on her bed, healed her, and told her to take him as her lover. And once you heard that from the Son of God, you're not going to look back. She swore off sex with her husband after bearing 14 children and insisted on getting a bishop to receive her vow of chastity. She went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Her companions ditched her and refused to let her back on the boat. She found herself stranded and homeless in Rome, and then eventually made it back to the town of Lynn in Norfolk, where her family enjoyed prominence. And in 1413, when Julian was 70, they met. What, in God's name, would that have been like? And I mean, what was it really like in the middle of a prosperous and complex medieval city, where rival factions were struggling for political and economic control, where a thriving Jewish community had disappeared 120 years earlier but was still remembered, where accusations of heresy were widespread and had potentially deadly consequences. I obsessed about those questions for years, and The Ram in the Thicket is the novel I wrote to answer them for myself. I've never had much patience with romanticized notions of the lives of medieval religious women. I'm convinced that Julian had her eyes open and was nobody's fool. I'm a retired professor of medieval literature. I gave seminars where we read Julian's and Marjorie's books. I walked the streets of Norwich to get a better feeling for the city and ended up plastered one afternoon before I knew it on really deadly cider in a pub that's been open since the 13th century. And then, the worse for the wear, I staggered over to the cathedral for evensong. We don't know when Julian became Julian. It almost certainly wasn't her name from birth. People knew her as Julian because she was enclosed as an anchoress at St. Julian's Church, maybe before her vision in May of 1373, but maybe years afterwards. So enclosed as an anchoress, we're already into what you may find nearly unthinkable. Taking a vow of enclosure meant promising to spend the rest of your life in an anchor hold, a cell, in the monastic sense, a room or a small house, often, but not always, built, mazel tov, built onto the side of a church. You had to petition the bishop for permission to do this. You had to demonstrate that you had sufficient resources not to become indigent. If the bishop gave consent, he administered last rites during the enclosure ceremony. You went into the anchor hold, and the door was bolted from the outside, symbolically burying you for dead to the world. Both women and men chose such a life, but statistically, women were the majority. And as grim as it sounds to us, it wasn't quite as it might seem. Because first of all, bolting the door was a symbolic action, not necessarily a once-for-all sealing of the cell. If you think about the symbolism of baptism into the death and resurrection of Christ, most people aren't drowned in the font. Some anchoresses appear to have had access to the church or even to the churchyard. And second, and I think this is even more important, anchor holds weren't in remote places. More frequently, they were in the middle of cities. St. Julian's Church is near the River Wensum in the southern part of Norwich's medieval core, just up a laneway from a thriving commercial port in 1413. Julian may have withdrawn from the world, but the world never withdrew from Julian. People passed by the anchor hold all the time, and some visited. Manuals of advice for anchoresses were written, surprise, by men, generally in the second person of direct address. And the authors are clearly twitchy about the liberties that anchoresses enjoyed in real life. They had maids who looked after their needs. A window connected the anchor hold with a parlor where the anchoress could receive visitors who came for spiritual counsel. Another window looked into the church, and a third window looked into the maid's room. But it's clear that sometimes there was actually a door through which the maid could come and go. The manuals advise anchoresses not to run a school, not to gossip, as too many lax anchoresses, the writers complain, are known to do. The best known of the manuals, the Ankrana Wissa, which was first written in the early 13th century, but it was copied and read for 2 centuries after that, practically sexualizes the openings into the anchor hold as though the cell itself were an extension of the anchoress's physical body. Projection? Surely not. Don't be like those slutty anchoresses who hang out their windows in tight sweaters, smoking unfiltered cigarettes, I sometimes imagine the author saying. They weren't nuns, they were lay women of some means, ultimately under the authority of no one but the bishop, who had more pressing matters to attend to than closely monitoring their conduct. Within the anchor hold, they had discretion over their lives, as married women generally did not, and as women who entered nunneries certainly did not. It was a life of contemplation, but it was also a life of community service. People, especially women, came to you for spiritual advice they couldn't get or didn't want from their parish priest. Despite what the manuals say, you took the vow to stay put as much for your visitors' sake as to withdraw from the world. And Julian's book bears the clear traces of conversations that she had with others over many years. The Ankrana Wissa advises that if an anchoress is going to keep an animal, it ought to be a cat. Cows can lead to lawsuits if they wander into somebody else's field. In short, the manuals don't really tell us what lived experience was like in the anchor hold. It's tempting to take very literally the descriptions of severe ascetic practice that medieval sources impose on the life of an anchoress, and it's easy to fall victim to a kind of reverse romanticism about the nature of an anchoress's life. Literally bricked up, isolated, unwavering in an intense devotion. That's the only thing that keeps her from going crazy. It's easy to make Julian into a two-dimensional cutout of mystical fervor. But it's in the gap between theory and practice that I think we can get a better feeling for what life in the cell might have been like for Julian, or for anyone else who felt called to a similar life. So the Julian I've imagined has a grainy, practical side. She's unafraid of the life of the body. Ugh. and she's used to talking to women trapped in bad marriages. She knows what it's like to doubt her own vocation and occasionally to long desperately for the wider world she's renounced. She's survived trauma and grieved the family she lost in the second wave of the plague when she was 19. She has no use for religious austerity for its own sake. Her maid, Alice, has been her companion since long before she entered the cell. And she dearly loves the wealthy merchant whose life she saved as a newborn orphan who needed a wet nurse to survive. And just to clarify, this is all imaginative construction of a life that might have been plausible. She loves his 11-year-old daughter like her own. She banters back and forth with her maid about what's happening in Norwich, and she knows the stakes of running afoul of the religious authorities. So again, with thanks to Sharon for being willing to read, here's the beginning of the second chapter of the book, where we get a glimpse of Julian's morning routine on the Monday of Holy Week, and where we hear a little about her upcoming first meeting with Marjorie Kemp.
Monday dawned gray and damp and cold. Julian woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the wind, grateful to have the cat curled against her legs. When she rose, the stone beneath her feet felt like the slab at the mouth of the tomb. The clay of the chamber pot was an icy mortification of the flesh. These last winters, she'd had less of her flesh to discipline, but the cold was all the crueler to the remainder. The early morning passed as it would till Christ gathered her death into his own. She dressed to the Paternoster and the Creed. The holy water in the basin chilled her fingertips and forehead. Hail, origin of our creation. Hail, price of our redemption. Hail, food for our pilgrimage. Hail, reward of our hope, she began. Some days the words held great comfort and sweetness, but her mind wandered easily at that hour. She'd struggled through the first years in the cell to calm the voices that came up underneath the words, before she learned to receive stillness as a gift never wholly possessed. Think of the wanderings as a descant over the tenor of the choir, Keister had said the first time they spoke about distractions. Or else unquiet simply begets more unquiet. It was then that she began to consider how in Richard Keister God had sent her solace for the loss of Father Thomas. Keister had believed her when she told him what she'd seen. He went on believing her when Thomas, the friend of her soul for 45 years, grew too old and ill to come to the window. If you can't tell all the world, write it down, Keister said, and pray that someone will take it up and read. Forget that I received the vision. It was meant for you, she admonished those who'd read what she'd written or heard some part of it. She'd arrived at the cell because she ached to tell those she met what she'd seen and grieved too often and too deeply when the telling came to naught. Love was the meaning of all that God had revealed to her, and the love for all that he had made, and for her fellow Christians generally. 9 in 10 of them thought she'd raved in her illness, was raving still to prate of her delirium. Thomas believed her when she gathered courage to tell him that the cross he'd held up in front of a dying woman had borne Jesus in his bleeding flesh. Thomas believed her when she told him that in her hand had lain creation like a hazelnut, ready to fall into nothingness if God stopped loving it from one moment to the next. Her mother prayed for her recovery. She hasn't been right since May, she heard her tell Thomas. Her mother had it backwards. Seeing Jesus bleed was the first time all had been well for 12 years since the plague had carried off her father and sister and husband and child. If he bled before her eyes, he'd been bleeding all along. He'd been bleeding when she was 19, and her daughter lay bawling and swollen in her arms the afternoon before they pried the tiny corpse away from her for burial in a lime pit. Set a guard over my lips, says the psalm, as if the speech that bursts forth from us, she thought, didn't come forth from us like the eternal word bursting from his grave. She steadied herself on the bedpost to kneel before the crucifix. The condition of her right knee appeared to please the Lord of heaven and earth as it was. She remained doubtful of his judgment in this, but looked forward to his thanks for the number of times she'd bent it. The words went on praying through her. Faithful cross, true sign of triumph, thou of all the noblest tree, none in foliage, none in blossom, none in fruit your equal be. Nimrod gave a start and jumped down from the bed as Alice knocked and opened the door. She could hear the scrape of the chamber pot behind her on the floor as Alice picked it up. The clean one told the hour as she set it down. Then came the splash of water flung from the wash basin into the churchyard. She struck her breast 5 times and rose to face the little panel of Christ's baptism. The painting was wretched. The dove above our Lord's head looked like a feathered stone dropped by the fiend to brain him, but she treasured it like some splendid image carried from Flanders. John had bought it for her in Barry when he was 15. By then, he looked a stripling with a beard coming, and no longer the oversized child who'd stood with Thomas at his wet nurse's sickbed 2 years before. By the time she was 30 and a half and lay ill, he'd grown up hearing from Thomas that she'd saved his life when his family died along with hers, and no other woman south of Timber Hill had milk to spare, or none who'd nurse a starving whelp from a plague-ridden house. She'd had nothing to lose when Thomas held him out toward her and pleaded. She drenched his head with her tears while he sucked her teat. He saved her life as surely as she saved his. After a month, as he grew, she could thank God of his mercy. When he was weaned, there was nothing more she wanted from the world. Let me know the pain you suffered for me. Give me a share in your wounds, and then lead me to death's door, she prayed in 1362. It took nearly 12 years for God to answer, long enough that she forgot she'd asked. She turned in silence to smile good morning. Alice wiped the table, poured water, cut bread, put a knife into the cheese, set out a bowl of cold boiled turnips. As Julian sat down, she bowed her head to acknowledge the service. The bread had started to dry out. Alice always baked on Friday afternoon, but the cheese was soft and fresh. As she cut into the bread, Alice joined her across the table and served herself. Leaping from the floor, Nimrod sniffed the cheese once before settling politely to one side. She had a surprisingly large appetite. Still, the last bite went to the cat. She brushed the crumbs from the table. Alice would sweep afterwards. They rose to face each other. Julian made the sign of the cross over her mouth. O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall declare thy praise. Make haste, O God, to deliver me. Make haste to help me, O Lord. Julian prostrated herself on the floor. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto. At the end of the Gloria, she stood and they sat at the table again. So, Henry tells me you'll be getting a visit from Screaming Madge, Alice said. I'm sure you'll be edified. Julian started to laugh. Do people really call her that? Only those within earshot when she starts in. I've heard the last child was her 14th. I heard 12th, said Alice. Her husband has a look of a man who likes to keep the field well plowed. Poor bugger. He seems a good enough sort, really. Squires who are around with a sad look in his eyes. They've heard service at the cathedral the last 4 days. They have lodgings north of Tombland. Henry can look forward to many holy conferences just down the street from Whitefriars. The last child is newborn, said Julian. It's not with them. Wet nurse at home in Lynn, I'd think. Her family's got pots of money. Her brother knows Norwichers among the companions of St. George, and the Priors people are from Burnham, as hers were before Lynn. But her husband's not so well off. It's sure they've not let the best rooms. Her brother's friends haven't taken them in. Alice paused for a moment before she began clearing the dishes from the table.
So later in that same chapter, an important line of the book's plot gets introduced: the political uses to which anti-Semitic prejudice could still be weaponized in social struggle 120 years after the expulsion of the Jews from England by Edward I in 1290. It doesn't seem all that outlandish to me that there were still citizens of Norwich known to be descended from converts. The memory of the vanished Jewish community was inscribed on the urban geography of the city, and also in one of the most regrettable phenomena of medieval Christianity, the accusation that Christian children were ritually murdered by the Jews at Passover. The first and most extensive of those stories arose in Norwich itself, nearly 300 years before the last years of Julian's life. The cult of Norwich's so-called child martyr William continued until the Reformation. And we know that there was a major shake-up in the governance of Norwich in the year that Julian met Marjorie. In telling my version of the story of Julian of Norwich, I couldn't imagine not foregrounding an aspect of her world that might easily have been swept aside, namely the memory of the vanished Jewish community and the stain on Norwich and on Christianity in Norwich, entailed by the veneration of a local blood libel saint for 400 years. If Julian's luminous vision of the love and mercy of God is worth anything, it's because there's room in it for acknowledgement of the cruelty and intolerance of which the pious are so often and so easily capable. As much, I might add, in 2025 as in 1413. And of course, this is one reason that I've titled my book with a reference to one of the most horrific stories in Scripture, Abraham's willingness to bind his son Isaac for sacrifice in obedience to God's command. To speak out of my very minimal acquaintance, the Jewish exegetical tradition does a far better job of acknowledging the heinousness of this story than does most Christian interpretation. Medieval rabbis were capable of acknowledging their revulsion at the suggestion that God could have commanded anything so abominable. Among Christian exegetes, Kierkegaard, in Fear and Trembling, manages not to gloss over the passage's unthinkability. So positing a continued memory of converts among the citizens of Norwich and a tiny remnant who still cling to Judaism over a century after the disappearance of the community was the longest limb I went out on in writing The Ram in the Thicket. But I ventured to do so out of what seemed to me a kind of ethical obligation. So here's the latter half of that same second chapter of the novel, in which the danger to those dear to Julian is first laid out.
Is there no salt left? Julian asked. Gone Saturday, I'll buy more after Easter. I can't bear the thought of talk in the market that the Lady Julian is attending to inclinations of the flesh during Holy Week. Your charity is a model for every Christian soul, but let's risk the scandal and buy it sooner. The truth is, Alice said, there's none to be had till the merchant's barge comes up from Yarmouth next Wednesday. I asked last week. If you crave it, there's a piece of salt cod I can cook for tomorrow. Please, yes, I'd like that very much. Could you do it with lentils like last time? That was very fine indeed. It's especially good when the bread starts to go stale. The compliment glowed visibly in Alice's face. It was one of Julian's great delights, to see her delight. And for these most solemn days, last year's turnips will count as Lenten discipline, Julian said. Alice spread her hands and gestured to the bowl on the table like an actor declaiming his lines in the plays on Whit Monday. These are the turnips of our affliction. Julian froze. Where did that come from? It's an old family joke. My grandfather used to say it when the food didn't please him. Why? It's God's direction to Moses when Israel came out of Egypt. The people are to remind themselves that the bread they eat as they flee is the bread of their affliction in bondage. Be careful with those words. They could mark you. I speak too much Latin and now too much scripture, said Alice. I'm not sure you're the one living under a rule of silence. I'm sure it's the condemned and the dead who have no choice. As long as Arundel is archbishop, and there's power to be gained from the whiff of burnt heretics, it's no bad idea to keep watch at the door of your lips. Julian lowered her voice as she spoke. The shutter on the window into the church wasn't that thick. How many people I talk to are likely to search scripture to find a joke they don't understand? More than one or two that gossip in taverns between Timber Hill and St. Peter Mancroft. I'm not saying it in jest, Alice. Things are different now. The plague doesn't swamp hatred and dread any longer. People imagine their lives are secure enough to turn on each other. It's not like when we were young. When we were young, a few wizened tosspots still actually remembered, Alice said. They're all dead. Their grandchildren are the wizened tosspots now. Well, almost. There's nothing left to remember. There's the saying that doesn't ring true, or at least familiar. There's the habit of baking every week the same day and hour when few others do. Please don't do it this Friday of all weeks. Do it a day early, and don't light candles. The light pleases me after sunset. Why shouldn't I? I can afford it once a week. It reminds me of Nana, God rest her. I've told you why your grandmother did it, said Julian. I've learned more from you about why my grandmother kept her house as she did than I learned from her. Alice shot back. It's you who've called forth in me what you know. You should be lecturing John and his wife, and her brother chanting away at the cathedral. You are never to say such a thing to me again, or to anyone, else it's on your head. Alice's wry, cheerful smile faded as Julian's anger sank in, along with the fear that lay beneath it. Her own fear rose to match it. I won't say anything again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry too. We're all sorry. We're sorry a lot. Julian felt her eyes glistening over. It took her by surprise to hear her own voice crack. We're all in the ditch together, aren't we? All in the ditch together. Alice reached across the table to take Julian's hand in hers. the younger woman's knuckles swollen, her palm calloused where Julian's was soft. It is the hand that swept this cell for 35 years, thought Julian. It's the hand that's brought meat and drink every day and carried away the stench of the chamber pot every morning. It's the hand of Christ, our Mother and our Lord, and the hand that will draw me forth from the grave. Julian's own mother had never cared much for Alice, the child who breaks things, she'd called her. In the months after the plague swept through Norwich the second time, the girl ran about the neighborhood with a pack of other children for whom the world had become half carnival and half nightmare, once their families had buried their dead. If they had family left at all, and they weren't sleeping under stalls in the Haymarket, fighting stray dogs for scraps. When John wasn't nursing, Julian walked the streets the children ran. Her parents' house was as empty as her own. The maid had died along with the others. She went back to fill a corner of it along with the baby, going about the errands before her mother, in her confusion, realized what needed to be done. Counterfeiting errands when there were none to be had, she crossed paths with the children from hour to hour. Alice Dullcrest was the weedy child whose family had escaped the scourge intact 2 houses down Gun Lane toward St. Stephen's. The Dullcrests had kept their children on a short tether till hell broke loose again in Norwich. Julian barely recognized her the first time she saw her careening down the lane. The girl always looked up at Julian, always met her smile with a greeting. After a few days, she began trailing on alongside for a few paces. Then she'd turn and catch up with the pack. They'd round the corner, running from death, while Julian trudged on good days, a pace ahead of despair. One afternoon, when she'd just crossed the Haymarket, Alice appeared beside her out of nowhere. At Julian's smile, the misery in the child's face only deepened. "They keep calling me pork pie," the girl sniveled. "They say they don't like me anymore." "Well, why wouldn't they like you? Were you mean to them?" "I didn't do anything. But this morning, Harry kept saying pork pie, and said my whole family were pork pies. Then he said my father probably only has half his thing." Julian swallowed her smirk as best she could. Children from a dozen houses southwest of the castle might have suffered such taunts, but in only 2 or 3 would parents solemnly take them aside to explain. The rest would be told just to ignore the foolishness. Dullcrests, it seemed, were among the latter. Julian saw Alice's mother and father at St. Stephen's most Sundays, her grandparents only at Easter. Her mother always seemed eager to explain that her husband's mother was too ill to leave the house. Enough of the neighbors had seen the old woman looking vigorous in the middle of the week to know she feigned the excuses. Some were sure they knew why. "What a silly thing to call somebody," Julian said. "Help me, I have too much to carry." She held onto 2 loaves, but handed over a small stoneware jar of beer. She'd have had the sense to give her the bread instead, save for the fear she'd soil it or drop it in the muck. The child was no cleaner than you'd expect of an urchin out of doors in the last 3 hours. The sun glared in their eyes as they walked along Gun Lane and stopped at Julian's door. Just across the threshold, the jar fell to the floor and broke. The beer splattered. "Now look what you've done," Julian said, her anger feigned, glad of something to take the girl's mind off the cruelty of friends. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I know. I drop things too sometimes." John began to cry from his cradle. Her mother, she thought, must be in the yard behind the house. The girl looked toward the crib. "I thought your baby died," she said. It's not her fault, Julian told herself, and took a deep breath to keep from screaming as the child's words pierced her heart like a sword. She did. That's a baby whose family all died. "Are you its mother now?" asked Alice. "No, but he'd die if I didn't feed him. A priest asked me." She was at the end of her patience. "He's hungry. You should go now." "Are you angry with me?" "No," Julian lied. "Do you like me?" She had milk for John. She wondered if she had charity for a neighbor's child as well. "Yes," she said, "I like you. But go and let me feed Johnny and clean up the beer." She fashioned a smile as best she could from the shards that lay to hand. When she stepped out into the street the next morning, Alice stood loitering at the door, a second child dragging her back from the edge of the grave. Catherine Dulcris seemed no more pleased that her daughter so often lingered on their doorstep than was Julian's mother, who finally wearied of saying there was blood in Alice's veins of those who'd martyred poor little St. William. Julian lost patience when she'd said it once too often. "Well, she's only part Jew, and you'd have to cut her in two to find it, and then who's the monster?" The shock of the retort ended her complaints, but Julian repented of the disrespect. Her mother had enough to grieve of her own, her suspicion of Alice a diversion, like Julian's feigned errands when there were none to be had. Yet through it all, her mother never refused the child entry, nor did Julian on her mother's behalf. She taught Alice to swaddle John when she needed 2 extra hands. The girl grew to make a good marriage, the likes of which would never have come before the plague to a girl from Gun Lane, albeit from a family with coin to spare. Later, she mourned Julian's entry into the cell, but salvaged her company by swearing no one else would serve for her. When Alice was widowed and moved for good into the adjoining cell, Julian beheld her grief as though seeing herself from a great distance. For the first year, Alice wept as she fed her, and as she had herself wept nursing John.
Sharon, thank you so much for reading so beautifully. I'm looking forward to talking with you for a while about the novel and continuing the conversation afterwards at the back of the sanctuary over a cup of tea and a cookie. Big surprise, I'm selling copies of the book off the back of a truck. And there is a flyer with a QR code if you want instead to order a copy of the book online, just in time to make a fabulous Christmas gift. What I will add in closing, one of the jobs of historical fiction is to bring the world of the past and the world of present readers together. And my friend Rabbi Jan Urbach wrote an uncannily good summary of some of the themes of my book. Uncanny because it describes the conditions of 2025 as well. Polarized political groups vie for power. Religious leaders push for harshly intolerant rules. Lies and cancellation hound those who don't fit in. A small minority suffering from inherited trauma are especially targeted. A charismatic outsider spreads conspiracy theories. A wise woman with influence but no power fights to do damage control behind the scenes. Welcome to Norwich, England, 1413. Thank you so much. Or just buy the book.
I don't know if this is on. It is on. Do we have any questions? Can you hear me? We have a mic set up. If anybody has a question, you will be heard. Well, maybe I'll just start off. David, could you talk a bit about how John Kemp, Marjorie's husband, took shape in your imagination? He's quite a one-dimensional person in her book. You know, he's sort of the person who stands between her and what she wants in her spiritual life. So of course he's not very well developed, but you brought him to life. Can you talk a bit about that process?
Thank you for appreciating what John became in the book. John Kemp is a very strange character in the book of Marjorie Kemp. He is, as Joanne just said, basically an obstacle to Marjorie getting what she wants, which is a bishop to receive her vow of chastity and give her a staff and a ring and white clothing in token of her newfound status. There are other fictional versions of John Kemp that make him out as, a reasonably unsympathetic character. But he accompanied Marjorie all over England. Clearly, he was running interference with the authorities and with the crowds that she was getting in trouble with. And there's one point at which they're coming back from the city of York, where they have gone to see the great cycle of plays that was performed at Corpus Christi. And they're on the road, and John Kemp, they're sitting down for something to eat, and John says, "Marjorie, if the choice were between having sex with me and seeing me die, which would you choose?" And without skipping a beat, she says, "I'd rather see you die." I understand this man as deeply attached to her and really very much loving her and looking for scraps from the table. And then finally, at the end of the book, when she's about to go off in pilgrimage, he really, well and truly has had enough. In the book of Marjorie Kemp, Marjorie eventually comes back to Lynn. She makes it back to England after being homeless in Rome and then going to Germany, where she appears to have had one of her sons living. And she cares for John in his old age. So that's what we know of the character. Yeah. And I have to confess, Marjorie reminds me a little of my Aunt Annabelle. So I think about Uncle Harold and Uncle Harold's relations with Aunt Annabelle, and I have to confess that went a little bit into my take on John Kemp.
David, I do have a question for you. But first, I want to say I am reading your book. I find it absolutely fascinating. I just can't imagine the life of somebody like Julian, and you do so very well. You must have a lovely imagination, very creative. But there's one thing, just not an important thing, but I just wonder, do you have any documented proof that Julian ate cold, baked, boiled turnip? This doesn't sound like the height of gourmet feeding. And I just wondered if you knew that happened really.
I have no way of knowing if she ate cold-boiled turnips, but they do seem suitably penitential for the Monday and Holy Week. And I've portrayed her as definitely appreciating good food, but also I've tried to portray her as someone who gratefully accepts what's available. And it does seem to me that gratefully accepting cold-boiled turnips is a mark of humility. I'll say one other thing unbidden. The cat. We have no evidence that Julian actually had a cat. What we have is that line in the Anchronowissa, which was written 200 years earlier, that if you've got to have an animal, make it a cat. Cows can lead to lawsuits. And I think when the writer of the Anchronowissa said that, he had something else in mind. I think he was actually, in a sense, trying to further restrict the interaction of an enclosed woman with the larger world. A cow is an economic investment, right? And you're likely to run into other people because of your cow. A cat is not an economic investment, but I can imagine a cleric who is dismissing women's spiritual lives as sentimental might say, oh, dear, it's fine. You can have a kitty if you want. I think the reason why everybody in the modern world wants Julian to have a cat is that, and if you look at most images of Julian, if you read other fictional accounts of Julian's life, there's almost always a cat. And I think for us, it's because it's more humanizing. We want her to be susceptible to ordinary human happiness. And there's nothing like a purring chaos machine in the cell to put you in touch with that. And the other thing I would say about it, and this was kind of operative in my novel, there's a sense in which the cat is wildness coming into the cell when the cell is a place of a life of discipline that is almost unthinkable to us, right? The cat brings in wildness, and there's a sense in which the cat is almost like the repressed unconscious of this deeply pious life. It's like it's Blake's lamb and Blake's tiger all rolled into one, and begging the question, did he who make the lamb make thee? So I'm sorry, that was just kind of a riff, but as long as we're imagining the daily texture of Julian's life in the cell, I think that's why we all want her to have a cat. Yeah.
Hi, David. How much of the discrimination against people who have had Jewish background is documented, and how much is your extrapolation?
Most of it is my extrapolation. That's really the longest limb I went out on. Most people assume that the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 was more or less complete. And for instance, every time you read a study of the Merchant of Venice, and you're talking about the character of Shylock, the first thing that gets said is, well, of course, Shakespeare had never met any Jews because there were no Jews in England. But there was, in fact, a domus conversorum, a house for converts, open in London into the 15th century. If there were no converts in the early 15th century, what was it doing there? And back in the 1280s, John Peckham, who was a Franciscan Archbishop of Canterbury, was off on a jag preaching sermons denouncing people who were making false conversions. So I've gone from there to positing the idea that the disappearance of the Jewish community was not as complete as we might think. And if you consider what happened in Spain and Portugal, where there were big communities of converts and they were under deep suspicion all the way through the 16th century, and that was one of the engines of the Spanish Inquisition, then it's plausible. And there actually is a documented community of hidden Jews who in the 1990s finally said, "We've been pretending to be Christian for 500 years, enough is enough." And they sent away for advisors to a synagogue in Lisbon. But in the meantime, they had created this extraordinary folk Judaism, all by oral tradition, no rabbis, passed down mostly through the women of the community. And I thought, okay, it's true that the Jewish communities were vastly larger in Iberia than they were in England. The Norwich Jewish community probably never numbered more than about 300 people, even at its height. But I don't think it's entirely implausible. And what got me so fixated on doing this is precisely the fact that Norwich is the site at which the blood libel first got articulated. And I almost felt like it was an ethical responsibility not to sweep that under the rug. So.
From the online community, and we don't have any yet. I encourage you who are watching online to contribute a question, and I'll relay it. But in the absence of that, I'd like to ask a question. I know you've worked on this for 25 years, I think. What is it that you enjoyed most? I mean, I'm sure that having worked on it that long, there were many things you didn't enjoy. But what was it that you enjoyed about this wonderful project?
I'll repeat the question. Anne was pointing out that I started working on this novel 25 years ago, and then it shelved it for a long time and started working on it again about 2.5 years ago. But Anne asked, what did I enjoy the most about the project? And I absolutely loved the week of wandering around Norwich, getting a feel for the city, getting a sense of what the geography of the city was like, going into the Norwich Public Record Office and finding the accounts of the cathedral priory in the early 15th century and checking the rolls for donations to various altars, including the altar of St. William. And as I did that for a week, a lot of the things that ended up in the novel came out of that. The first draft of the novel was in Julian's own voice. It was going to be in the first person, and then I realized this was not going to work out if I wanted to tell a story about this larger social world that she was part of. It couldn't all happen by conversations that were coming into the cell. But the other thing was there were just so many cool medieval buildings in Norwich that I wanted to describe. And, I incorporated that pub where I got sloshed on cider. There's a reference to that pub. There's a scene where people are wandering through the central market at night. I wouldn't have written that scene if that central market didn't still exist in that same place. So I loved finding that trail of breadcrumbs in the archival evidence, and then by actually walking around medieval Norwich, the medieval core of Norwich, and thinking, oh, God, what a fabulous thing to incorporate into the novel. So, the best thing about being a medievalist is that they hand you 700-year-old books and parchments and let you play with them. That's what's good about being a medievalist.
Community. Can you hear me now? Okay. So Pam Thompson writes, how did you decide about Julian's personality, such as her reaction to the drunks, Her talks to herself, her opinions we hear, but she never says.
Sometimes people talk about Julian as though she were sheltered or naive. And I can't imagine anything further from what we can assume about her life. She was 6 years old, the first time the plague came through England, and a third of the population, maybe more than that, died within 6 or 8 months, right? When she was 19 years old, the second wave of the plague hit. If she was married, we don't know if she was married, but it's absolutely plausible that she lost not only her family of origin, but a husband, a child. The idea that Julian was quiet as a nun, breathless with adoration, in the words of Wordsworth, doesn't make sense to me. This is a woman who had survived trauma. This is a woman who clearly understood and respected and valued the life of the body, and that's shot through her whole book. And I can't imagine that she could have lived the life she lived in the cell without a healthy sense of irony about the gap between the ideals of her life and the lived experience of life. I think it's true for most people. A life of faith is a life of recognizing that there's the theory and the perfection, and then there's what happens on Monday morning. Or as a Buddhist scholar titled a book, After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And the incongruity of that is always part of the life of faith, and the more intense one's interior experience, I think the more that incongruity has to come to the fore. So, Pam, thank you for the question, but that's why I chose to represent her as having kind of a wry side. And you would need that to survive multiple conversations with Marjorie, I think. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for this, David. This is really fascinating. As you were speaking about wandering through Norwich and doing your research, I wonder how significant was it that you were fluent in Latin in your research, and how did that feed into your creativity? That is, did it matter that you were fluent in Latin in your research, and how did that feed into your imagining this character, and was it significant that it's a dead language we're talking about, even although it's very much alive in you and your creativity?
Yeah, thank you. Julian's book is in English, right? It's the first, as I said, it's the first book in the English language that we know for certain had a woman as author. But her life in the cell would have been steeped in the recitation of the office. It would have been steeped in the language of the Psalms. In the opening chapter of the book, Richard Caster, who gets mentioned here, who has become her confessor relatively late in her life, is telling her it was a mistake to teach Alice the responses at the beginning of the office in Latin, because if somebody else hears her, they're going to be suspicious of a woman who's speaking Latin like a priest. I guess what I would say in response to that is that because I've done a lot of my academic work in Latin, I'm also, my awareness of the tension between the use of Latin as a language of high culture and the use of the vernacular in the 14th to 15th centuries, it gave me a more heightened sense of what it meant for Julian to bust out of that mold and write what Nicholas Watson would call vernacular theology, right? He prefers that term to devotional literature because he really wanted to foreground the actual theological content, which can easily get sidelined because if you work on medieval religion, you're used to thinking of serious theology as being written in Latin, and then there's devotional literature. Whereas Julian is really one of the great Christian thinkers, and Dennis Turner actually wrote a book on, a professor of religion at the Yale Divinity School, wrote a book on Julian as a systematic theologian, which is a tall order because, Julian's book is very circular. But I guess it's the gap between the Latin and Julian's vernacular presence that, I had a heightened sense of that. Thank you. Penny.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, David. I was introduced to Julian about 30 years ago through Margaret Brennan over at Regis. But unfortunately, I didn't stay with her. And so my question for you, as a woman myself, who struggles with much of what I feel still is our patriarchal church, how can Julian feed that deep longing for me to draw close to that ultimate mystery?
Oh, well, there are two versions of Julian's book. There's a short text that she wrote down maybe fairly soon after the vision, or maybe later, we don't really know. But then she thought about it for 20 years, and she wrote this vastly expanded second edition of the book, as it were. And I won't nerd out by telling you about the manuscripts, but because it's probably time for tea pretty soon. But in the second expanded version, she explores very deeply and very thoughtfully how it is that God needs to be understood as mother as well as being understood as father, and how Jesus is both brother and mother. So the motherhood of God, the motherhood of Jesus, is an enormous part of her expansion in the second version of the book. And it's one of the most powerful images I know of in the Western Christian tradition for the divinity of the feminine and the essentially feminine nature of that divinity, that we have to understand Jesus as mother as well as brother. We have to understand God as mother as well as understanding God as father, or we don't have a full picture of our relationship with God. So that's my pitch for what Julian can do for you. Unless there's one more question, why don't we go have a cup of tea and a cookie, and we can go on talking for a little while there. I think we probably need to, be ready to leave the church in about 20 minutes. But Thank you so much for coming.